Hi everyone, it's Kathy. Thank you so much for joining me. I am really excited to share this card with you. When I first saw the Sneaking Santa die set, it just made me smile. I decided to add a whole bunch of extra little details to this card, and that is what I wanted to share most with you today. So I started out with a little bit of the Reindeer texture paste, and I wanted to have a little piece of cardstock that looked like brick, so that my roof had a brick house to sit on top of. So I mixed up my Reindeer texture paste with a little bit of my Fired Brick Distress Oxide ink refill. If you don't have the refill, you can very easily smush an ink pad and mix it that way as well. I just wanted to have it be a pretty deep red, so that's why I used my refill. Once I had that mixed up in with the texture paste, I used a palette knife to spread that over a piece of light gray cardstock using the brick pattern stencil. Then I removed my stencil and I set that into a bucket of warm water to make sure that I got it cleaned off right away, and set my stenciled piece off to the side to dry. For my chimney, I did a little bit of ink blending onto a piece of white cardstock, and then I ran it through with the chimney dye with the bricks so that the bricks would be red. And I was very careful when I removed it from the dye so that the bricks would stay in place. Then I used my chisel tip two-way glue pen and added that just to the back side of the bricks. I had also die cut the solid chimney from a light gray cardstock. Once I had the glue applied to the back side of the bricks, I adhered that to the top of the plain chimney, and then I used my stylus tool to push those bricks down to make sure they stuck to the chimney really well, and then I just peeled away the top layer of the chimney. And the reason that I did that way was so that the bricks on the chimney would also be elevated to match the bricks on the lower portion of my house. To create my night sky, I did ink blending on a piece of cardstock that measures 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I did the bottom 2/3 with Stormy Sky Distress Oxide ink and the top third with Chipped Sapphire Distress Oxide ink. I had also cut a mask to mask off that portion for my moon, and then I used Fossilized Amber and Mustard Seed Distress Oxide ink to add color to the moon. I die cut the reindeer and the Santa from Cougar Super Smooth cardstock and decided to color them up with my Copic markers. For the reindeer, I just colored in his antlers with E31. To add details to the reindeer, I came in with my C0 marker and just drew in lines so that I could separate the bag from his body. And for the neck, I guess, the neck of the bag at the very top, I just drew 2 lines so it would appear that he's holding it with both of his hands. I guess, for this video, this little reindeer is going to have hands. Once I had my lines drawn in with the C0 marker, I came in with R59 and started coloring in the bag. I was pretty light-handed with the R59 at first and held the marker straight up and down so that I could go over the lines that I had drawn in with the C0 marker. And then I blended that out with R27, and then I finished off the bag with R24. If the idea of adding in little details like I did on the bag to separate the bag from the deer's body makes you a little bit nervous, start with a really light color like I did, the C0, because that gives you a little bit of wiggle room, and if you do make a mistake, it's very easy to cover up with any of the darker colors that you're going to color your image in with. Anyway, moving right along, to color in the deer's body, I started with E37. I added that underneath the bag, above the bag, at the bottom of his ear, along the back side of his legs, and then underneath his little belly, and along the bottom of his snout. I used that very light-handed because I wanted to have just a little bit of darkness and a little bit of a shadow in those particular areas. Then I came in with E35 and blended that out. I left a little bit of white space on his belly and then on the tops of each of his legs and the top of his snout and his face. and then I finished him up with E34. When you die cut the reindeer and the Santa, there's a little piece that cuts out of his eye, and I made sure to save that little piece. I set that off to the side. I used the C7 marker to color in the little pupil part that's left in there. Then I took the white piece that was die cut out and used my tweezers to paper piece it right back into place. For the Santa, I did the same thing with my C0 marker and used it to outline the areas to create definition, specifically on his hat, around his face, and the cuffs at the bottoms of his sleeves. And really, I just kind of eyeballed this whole thing with Santa. I wasn't trying to be exact. I figured that if I just had a baseline to go by from the C0 marker, that it would make it easier to color in the image. The coloring that I did on the Santa was pretty basic. I started out by coloring in the rim of his hat and his beard. Initially, I started with C3 and added some shading at the outer edges of the white fluffy part of his hat, and then right underneath his hat and underneath his nose. Then I did some just random flick marks on his beard just to add a little bit of texture. Then I came in with C5 because I thought that I needed to have a little bit more separation between his hat and his beard. So I did the line at the very bottom of his hat with the C5 and then added it to the very outer edges and then the very top of the white fluffy part of his hat too. I came back in with the C3 and lightened up the C5 a little bit, left some pretty good white space, and then finished off his hat and his beard with C1. To color in the Santa suit, I used the same reds that I did on the bag that the reindeer is holding. I started out with R59 and added that in the areas where I wanted it to be the darkest. So just above the fuzzy trim on his hat and then underneath his beard, and then kind of just an outline of underneath his arm and then underneath his legs and at the very bottom of his mittens and below the cuff on his sleeves as well. And then I blended that out with the R27 and I left a little bit of a white space down the diagonal part of his little Santa suit and I filled that in with R24. After I was done with the coloring, I wanted to add some texture to the fuzzy parts of his hat and the cuffs on his sleeves. So I used my white gel pen and did kind of like a scribbly motion just to brighten up the white, but I didn't totally cover the markers underneath, just to add that extra little bit of dimension. For his eye, I did the same thing with the C7 marker for the pupil part, and then I used my tweezers to paper piece in the white part of his eyes back into place. Next, I think this is probably one of my favorite parts of the card, is I had die cut all the snowy pieces from white cardstock. Then I used glossy accents and did a sort of a thin layer on all of those white pieces. Next, I grabbed the snow in the shape of a roof with my tweezers on the very, very end, and then I dumped some puff embossing powder on top of that, and then I heat set it with my heat tool. The trick in using the puff embossing powder is to use something like the glossy accents underneath it and make sure that your heat tool is nice and hot, and the puff embossing powder will start to bubble, but it adds so much texture and so much fun to the little snowy pieces. So anyway, moving right along, I had cut down the brick stenciled panel to just a small sliver. Bonus, I have extra left over so I can make a couple of more cards. And I adhered that to the very bottom of my background panel that I had done the ink blending on. I did do a little bit of ink blending around the roof, which I had die cut from gray cardstock. And off camera, I had colored the strand of lights with Copic markers. I used liquid glue to adhere the strand of lights to the roof. Next, I adhered the top piece of the dormer to the bottom piece of the dormer, and I cut those from a light gray cardstock, and I did a little bit of ink blending on the very outer edges of those pieces as well. I used liquid glue to adhere the snow to the top of the dormer, and then I put some foam tape on the back of that and added that to the front of my roof. I also used liquid glue to add the snow to the top of the roof and the top of the chimney. I used a little bit of liquid glue on the back of the roof to adhere the chimney to the roof, and then I put a whole bunch of foam tape on the back of that as well. I adhered that to the front of my card panel, and once I had that pressed into place, it was time to put my little reindeer and my Santa on top of the roof. I used liquid glue to adhere those two guys into place. The very final detail that I wanted to add was some snow. So I used my white gel pen and just started doing little dots all over the front of my card. I even made sure to add little white snow dots on top of the reindeer as well as Santa and the roof, just to make it look like there was a whole bunch of snow falling. And then I adhered that panel to the front of a top folding A2 size note card. And that's it. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, we'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.